Hey, peace and salutations, good people. I am Colin Ehara. Welcome to the Paper Plane podcast. The Paper Plane is a podcast created and hosted by myself where I will be interviewing people I am blessed and honored to share community with, and I'll be asking them about a book that has had a transformational impact on their lives. In a society where literacy rates are steadily declining and a growing number of podcasts hosted specifically by cishet men consciously or unconsciously champion expressions of masculinity and manhood that come at the expense of women, femmes, and LGBTQIA, Two-Spirit Plus, especially BIPOC folks. This space aims imperfectly and humanly to operate as a counter-narrative. The Paper Plane is a space that intends to highlight the dire importance of relationships, community, dialogue, perpetual learning, honest expression as art, art as honest expression, freedom for literacy, and literacy for freedom. It speaks to planes of existence attached to the act of reading, but also as a metaphor for the flights we take as we sit in what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls a one-way interface as readers and how these journeys shape us. I am incredibly excited that my first guest ever on the Paper Plane podcast is also my best friend, beloved spouse, wifey of 16 years, my partner of 23 years, and the co-parent and mother of our two daughters, Aya and Mayari. Emalyn Lopez is a Bay Area Pinay artist and designer who has earned a bachelor's degree in fine arts at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where we met, and a master's degree in graphic design at the Academy of Art University in San Francisco, her hometown. She has showcased and been recognized for her art, design, and film works at the New York's National Art Directors Club, Washington, D.C.'s Earth Echo International Student Environmental Film Festival, University of California, Santa Cruz Open Studios, San Francisco's Kearny Street Workshop, Manila Town Heritage Foundation, National Japanese American Historical Society, Academy of Art University Gallery, 111 Minna Art Gallery, Life and Times, OK Player, Oaktown Music Festival, Ottawa International Animation Festival, Imagine Awards, and Sinarte. Emalyn spent most of her life in San Francisco and is currently residing in El Cerrito, California with her husband, myself, and two daughters working as an educator and freelancing in design for local companies, nonprofit organizations, and musicians here in the Bay Area. She also enjoys and is very talented at photography and painting. Today, Em and I will be discussing the novel Minor Detail, written by the Palestinian heritage writer Adania Shibli. Welcome, Em. Thank you so much for being here on the Paper Plane podcast. I, as with all things, appreciate your support and am excited to talk with you about this novel that you recommended I read that I just finished today and really, really enjoyed.
No. Thanks
Thank you
for having me.
Yeah. So Adania Shibli was born in Palestine in 1974, is an author and essayist. She's mainly known for the 2020 translation of her novel Minor Detail into English by Elizabeth Jacquet that we'll be talking about today, as well as its 2022 translation into German by Gunther Orff, which formed the subject of public controversy in Germany following the cancellation of a literary prize for this book, originally scheduled for the 2023 Frankfurt Book Fair. So this was awarded a prize, and then that prize was rescinded. So something for us to be thinking about as we discuss. Shibli was born in Palestine, 1974, holds a PhD from the University of East London in Media and Cultural Studies. Her dissertation is titled Visual Terror, a study of the visual compositions of the 9/11 attacks and major attacks in the quote-unquote war on terror by British and French television networks. She also completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the EUME Research Center of the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin, Germany. Shibli has taught at the University of Nottingham and since 2013 has worked as a part-time professor at the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University in Palestine. Shibli and her children split their time between Jerusalem and Berlin. Shibli speaks Arabic, English, Hebrew, French, Korean, and German. And today, Em and I will be discussing the following themes in this short but tremendously powerful novel that Em chose to have our discussion on today. There are 7 themes. The first, the power of silence and ambiguity. Number 2, themes of trauma and memory. 3, narrative structure and dual perspectives. 4, the politics of space and place. 5, gender and violence. 6, the unspoken and the unseen. And lastly, number 7, the role of empathy in art and storytelling. And before we jump into that, I want to say explicitly, overtly, that there are going to be many, many spoiler alerts in here. If you are okay with that, please listen on. And also, content warning regarding sexual violence, violence against women, war, militarization, and settler colonialism are all topics that we're going to be discussing today. And so, before we kind of jump into that, actually, I'm going to read from the back of the book itself, kind of a brief breakdown of this novella. This spare and haunting novel cuts to the heart of the experience of erasure, dispossession, and life under occupation in Palestine, and reveals the difficulty of piecing together the shards of a narrative concealed by a fragmented history. Minor Detail begins during the summer of 1949, 1 year after the war that the Palestinians mourn as the Nakba, the catastrophe that led to the displacement and expulsion of some 700,000 people. Israeli soldiers attack a group of Bedouins in the Negev desert, killing everyone except a teenage girl. They capture the girl and later rape her, kill her, and bury her in the sand. Many years later, in the near present day, a woman in Ramallah tries to uncover some of the details surrounding this particular rape and murder and becomes fascinated to the point of obsession, not only because of the nature of the crime, but because it was committed exactly 25 years to the day before she was born. Adania Shibli masterfully overlays these two translucent narratives to evoke a present forever haunted by the past. And so, welcome again. And my opening question for you about this novel that you've chosen is what did you enjoy about Shibli's novel? What made you want to discuss Minor Detail today?
Yeah. Well, so the way I sort of came across this novel, actually was having a discussion with a close friend of mine, Ben Arsmani Calvert. Shout out to Ben here for telling me about this book, this amazing book. And I was searching for short stories because like as a parent, it's just really hard to find time to read or like finish a novel. And so we were just discussing like what are current ones that we came across. So he told me about this. And love this, like what Shibli has um has done with this. I think the what's intriguing about it is just sort of the dual structure of like writing, in the past and like, writing in present time. And all the themes that you had mentioned in the beginning. It's just a very intense, kind of haunting story. And I've always been working around historical trauma and like captivated by that, and the concept of fragmentation, the effects of settler colonialism on our bodies and our minds, and also making a point to, given the current sort of like climate and like, to read more stories by Palestinian writers. I think I've been kind of engrossed in that sort of in my time off. I've read multiple stories now, and this by far is just one that I have been moved by. And then also just, there was a description there on the back that you didn't read, but what also kind of
Well, I'm gonna
captivated
go
me.
into that later, but keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, it was just like, that one of the characters in this story is described to be on like high on the autism spectrum. And so, I've been, also reading stuff about that and like
Hmm.
neurodivergence and just, with our daughter, our oldest daughter, being on the spectrum, I was just really, curious about what, the mind of that.
Mm.
Yeah. So
Absolutely. Yeah, really beautifully said. And, as you know very well, as someone who helped me survive grad school, right? Like the idea of fragmentation and, kintsukuroi being kind of at the heart of like this metaphor that I used in grad school to like think about healing from intergenerational trauma. Definitely, definitely super ringing true. And then yeah, I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts about neurodivergency. But going to jump into kind of this first theme of the power of silence and ambiguity. And so, minor detail, notable for its spare, restrained prose, ambiguous storytelling. One of my mentors, Dr. Jeff Duncan Andrade, says brevity is brilliance. And so the ability to like, put a whole lot of information and powerfully into a small amount of space. And in this case, it was like, I think 105 pages. Just incredibly brilliant on Shibli's part. But as an artist, as an educator, as a mama, as so many different things, how do you interpret the role of silence in this narrative? How can it be a powerful tool in both visual art, literature, education, anything that comes to mind for you?
yeah. Um, I mean, there's like just a whole lot of, just dimension around, how Shibli uses like silence and how it's conveyed in this, story. I think, silence, when I think of silence, I think of like silence as like the absence of, right?
Mm,
So it's, the erasure of people and the dispossession and the destruction of land through time and like the silencing of stories and perspectives for
mm,
what gets left out, like of the dominant narratives, or like the silencing of language. And then there's also like the power that silence holds
mm,
when choosing to reveal certain parts of a story or a
yeah.
picture in order to allow, a reader to create kind of their own sort of narrative or piecing together, what the story is about. And so I think, that sort of ambiguity, I think, is what my understanding is like what Chablis is like fascinated by. And I
Mm,
think, for me, like resonates with me as an artist. Because, as an artist, I think, silence is meant to engage the audience, right? So, you invite people to, formulate their own ideas and concepts. Um, and, it transcends like language. I think in this sort of literature, it provokes like action or like it allows you to kind of like open the story, like where maybe it relieves the writer of like, you know, from themselves, like from their role as a narrator and like
mm,
allows the audience to then, create again, like create their own narrative. And I think that
mm,
Shibley is very like conscious of this.
mm,
And I think that that's like a way that sparks inspiration.
yeah.
Um, and, you know, the like how it's like a powerful tool, I think it's, it's a value. The story is sort of like this valuable, like piece of artifact that,
Mm,
kind of explores like unconventional ways to construct a narrative.
yep.
So like it's, being able to choose part of a story that you want to tell is sort of like in art is like cropping into like a photo.
That's
And
that's
one
cool.
person first sees like, like I might like crop really, really close into, like if it's a portrait of a person, it could be like a really like macro like crop into like, I know a part of their skin, right? And so like what kind of
Interesting.
comes up or is conjured like from that and like you being able to like look out. So I think, that ambiguity I think is really powerful. So it's really kind of like this framing is I see like how Shibli is like applying like silence. Um,
Mm,
but I don't know. That's kind of what I where my mind went towards when I was like
yeah,
looking and reading this.
absolutely. And I like I don't know what you said about her doing this really amazing job of like with the ambiguity and the like empty spaces, maybe we could call it, like
Mhm.
allowing the reader to like, kind of almost like, yeah, gently like nudging the reader to like make their own
Yeah.
interpretations. And I know you and I have listened to like a lot of Ta-Nehisi Coates interviews,
Yeah.
since he put out the message and we both read it. Um, but like him talking about like him wrestling with the idea, but ultimately accepting the idea that the reader gets to have their own relationship with his book, and
Hmm.
he put his book out, and then just like he doesn't get to control kind of like how people interact with it. um and it seems like she has a deep understanding of that, and like
Yeah.
that you were naming. um
Yeah. And it's yeah, I think like with that, I feel like I wonder if that is because, like, when you like her being Palestinian, right? Like, and you've been in this like occupied and like
mhm,
you've gone through like, the control and like trauma and of like, genocide. It's just kind of like this way of like to relinquish that control. I
mm,
think there's a way of, you know, it's almost like it's being expressed like through her of um like through the technique in her like writing or like
yep,
this use
absolutely.
use of like unconventional like narrative.
Woo,
But
absolutely, absolutely. um and in that vein, this is a perfect segue into the kind of the second piece around themes of trauma and memory. And so, minor detail juxtaposes historical events with contemporary experiences, revealing all these different layers of trauma and memory. And so, my next question for you is, how do you think Shibli's approach to the themes of remembrance resonate with your work as an artist, your experience as an educator, and or the ways you think about personal or generational healing from those forms of trauma?
yeah, I think, what I appreciate about this novel is that I don't know, like Shibli doesn't really it doesn't make it a point or like goal to talk about like trauma. She like
Hmm.
kind of like paints it like in her
Yeah.
language and stream of the stream of consciousness like she kind of taps into with the characters and the
Hmm.
tone in her language when describing like the landscape like you can really like kind of witness and feel the layers of trauma through like her use of um, like repetition and like objects and sounds that reappear throughout like the book.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's like this, playing with this concept of memory, like how to translate like something that you've seen, like, in this situation to like what does it look like in this location.
Oh my
So
God.
yeah, so it's like, seeing her like kind of play with that just allows, readers to kind of gain a deeper understanding of um the political climate and like the
Yep.
historical violence of like trauma.
Hmm.
As an artist, I think, for me, and as I kind of like can relate to sort of this style, like I've always been like captivated by these painters that were like considered abstract
Hmm.
expressionists or
Yep.
like surrealist painters, right? And because there was this way they're trying to tap into the subconsciousness. And I think a lot of that is like because, you're like, it's the feeling of like liberation, like this feeling of like wanting to
Hmm.
free yourself from like, things that are controlling or like things
Hmm.
that have like rules and like boundaries. And so, I guess when I think about art, it's like, like this sense of, or like art as like a practice and like this freedom to, be able to express like your individualism. And like,
Yep.
I think that, I don't know, like in this way that, when people do kind of tap into this subconsciousness, like what comes with it is like the rawness of, like the reveal of like of the internal person. And like in that sometimes you'll see the trauma, like you'll see like this uncovering of,
Yeah.
pain and suffering. So I feel like I relate to this kind of style
Yeah.
of her writing, because I don't know if like you remember sort of the paintings that I did back in the day in like
Definitely
undergrad. It
thinking.
was
I was
very
definitely
kind of
thinking
like,
about that.
yeah, very like Polak, like, this playing to music and like tapping of like,
Yeah.
my paintbrush to like create these like brush strokes, and they're kind of like marks of like my existence, like, and
Mm.
like, so that's kind of, I feel like what Adania like Shibli does with her writing is like
Totally.
she's just like, it's this like stream of consciousness, like,
Yeah.
um
And this was fresh on my mind too because for those listening, so Em and I just took our daughters to Santa Cruz. We just got back today. And we're essentially sharing with our 6-year-old and our 2-year-old, like, this is where mommy and daddy met and fell in love, and drove past the art studios where Em and I wandered over to on one of our first, I don't know if it was official or unofficial dates. But it was making me think of, like, you talking about the artwork that you were working on. And I remember, I think even just like, the question I asked you previous to this one around like the silence piece. And like, I remember, that was now over 20 years ago. Like, you're talking about, um, you know, expressions of, breaking silence, or like, or, and then like you said earlier, the power of silence too,
mhm.
how it could be powering and disempowering. Um, let's see. Um, I have a throw-in question here. When it comes to kind of um, memory trauma, some of these themes that you're talking about, are there any pieces that, like, when you think about, being a parent, being a mama, that kind of like want to pass to our children as far as generational healing goes? Like, or just like
Mhm.
hopes, intentions, aims?
Yeah, I think, gosh, like that I
Sorry,
want
that
to
was a
pass
big
on.
question. Yeah,
Uh, um,
in the vein of healing.
right. Yeah, I think, um, I'm currently reading like Gabor Mate's like Myth of Normal, and, you know, um, and in thinking about like trauma and like chronic sort of illness, or like things that how trauma sort of affects your body. And like, so I think, like what, it's important to make sure that we're constantly like processing like
Yep.
trauma, right? Because like trauma is kind of like like these scars that have been like kind of inflicted over time. So they're like these like, deep wounds of like history. So I think, for me is like, for, growing up first generation, and like my parents like not being able to kind of, um process like trauma, um
Mm-hmm.
or like don't have the language to.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, for me, it's like important for me to do like this work, and like to read, and like, find language, and like, ways for me to like, put, you know, describe, put words, and name them. So I
Mm.
think, like that's something, like that I want to be able
Yeah.
to, give access to, and Mayari is like them
Mm.
being able to like process it in their own like way. And because, just processing it is healing in itself.
Absolutely.
And, doesn't matter like, how long, you just, starting to just talk about it.
Yeah.
And identifying it and like having somebody there to like listen
hmm
is incredibly healing and validating.
Mm. It was making me think of like um some of the social emotional learning stuff that like I was doing, in kindergarten, first grade, and like
Yeah,
like
the
or like
colors and
yeah, and like identifying
of
with the
emotions.
different emotions and like
Yeah.
in a I was gonna say not up inside out, inside out, and inside out too. Um,
Yeah, I think, like how I was kind of relating it to kind of art, like there's, trauma can be expressed in many ways, right? Like it doesn't necessarily have to be words or language. It could be like what I was mentioning about like painting for me was the way for me to process
yeah.
loneliness, right? And like not feeling like my existence was validated. So, like how can I make this like show like how can I show myself to the world? But
Mm,
yeah, so whether that be like with our kids, like if they, find different forms of, you know,
yeah.
um to express themselves, like even through dance, or like I could totally see Aya just
Uh,
performance art.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is a nice, again, a nice segue into this next kind of set of questions I want to ask you about. Because um, I was thinking about kind of the novel being, divided into multiple parts, presenting these vastly different perspectives. You have on one hand, beginning in August in the past, right, of 1949, with this omniscient narrator following a nameless Israeli military commander who directly and indirectly commits these horrific, acts of violence against a young Arab Bedouin woman that he and his soldiers capture. And then section two, Palestinian woman in the present, who is also they never name, becoming the narrator who learns of these historical atrocities that happened to take place 25 years, to the day before she is born. And then she endeavors on this quest to dig up the past, right? And you were talking about like kind of uncovering, right? And how, that can be, you alluded to like it can be really healing, but also, can be really, really difficult and really, really hard. Um, and So, in all of those kind of veins, I'm wondering, you already spoke to some of this, but what impact did kind of the structural choice have of kind of like, this past and the present, and like, I would argue, I imagine you would agree, like, kind of the oppressor's kind of perspective, and then, and then the oppressed's, um, and those like kind of things like kind of happening in different places, but simultaneously in the book. Um, and how did that structural choice like, or I'm sorry, what impact did that choice have on your understanding of the story? And then do you see any parallels, in this duality and or structure and working with young people and or creating art?
Yeah, I think, with it's interesting because, there's like the male and the female perspective, the
Mm-hmm.
soldier and like the Palestinian like, perspective um and I think was the what's interesting is like, with the dual perspective is like, usually when I don't know, like I'm used to kind of sort of looking at perspectives within the same sort of situation that's happening, where it's like,
Mm,
in the first part of the story, with, the Bedouin girl who is like gang raped, right? And you mostly get that first part is basically through the soldiers or the commander's perspective.
yep.
And then as I'm reading it, like I'm curious about, okay, what is the woman in that time, like what is her perspective? Because you don't
Yeah.
hear that, right? Like it's
Yep.
like and what you do hear, right, is like the present time of the Palestinian woman who is reads about this, right? And like, so I think there's this really cool thing that Shibli does is like even though we don't get the perspective of the woman who is gang raped, right?
Hmm.
Because I'm curious about that. Like
Yep.
we are looking through time the effects of like a, woman who's like now in her she's 25, right? Because it's 25 years after like where she comes across this article of the gang rape happening. Um so we're seeing kind of learning the effects of um genocide and like settler colonialism through this, like this, a young adult, like, um, and I think like that, I don't know, there's something about that I felt was really intriguing and that
Mm,
um, is just the perspective carried through time.
hmm.
But also at the same time, the male and female perspective. Um,
Yep.
and then seeing just outside of like you know the um sort of what happens in the mind,
Mm,
is like seeing sort of w- how it's carried like through the land or like
yeah.
the space, right? I don't know, the whole sort of like layers of duality, I think is just I just is really captivating.
Yeah.
And like
It
the sort of cognitive differences between like, the
I,
thinking of, right, like of the male, the soldier,
I
the
was just
commander, and
going to
like
talk about that. Yeah.
is like, that whole thing is just wild. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was making me think about, thank you so much for sharing, because like as you were saying that, what it made me kind of remember around some of the structure part is like, with this, uh, male Israeli commander, part of the occupying forces during the Nakba. You have this, narrator that's kind of like outside of the character, right? The protagonist of that first part, and it made me kind of like wonder if Shibli kind of, and I imagine, there's like a lot of that was purposeful, but wondering if maybe a piece of that was like, I don't know, I think about, as boys, not only raised in US society, but I would argue in the world at large, like around like kind of patriarchy, like in order to, successfully step into oppressor roles as men and male bodied people, um, that we detach from our hearts, from our minds, in order to colonize, do these kind of horrific things, to go to war, for rich people, for example. And so like him doing these horrific things and like having the narrator kind of like be like kind of show the ways that he, like I'm wondering if there's a piece that's like showing how you know uh how uh, 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 fractured, he is to to do these ultimately sociopathic,
Right.
psychotic, or horrific things to another human being. um, Whereas, if I'm juxtaposing that with the protagonist in the second part, this Palestinian heritage woman, she is so deeply in touch with her thoughts and her feelings. That it's
Yeah.
like almost like overwhelming for her because
Right.
how touched in touch
That-
she is. Um,
Yeah.
which which actually can I ask you the next question that kind of talks a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah.
And then so you noted this like one of the quotes on the back from the South African Australian writer J.M. Coetzee on the back of the book says Adania Shibli takes a gamble in entrusting our access to the key event in her novel, The Rape and Murder of a Young Bedouin Woman, to two profoundly self-absorbed narrators, an Israeli psychopath and a Palestinian amateur sleuth high on the autism scale. But her method of indirection justifies itself as fully as the book reaches its heart-stopping conclusion. And so the question I have for you, as the mother, parent of a child on the autism spectrum, what thoughts or feelings took shape as you stepped into the mind of our potentially neurodivergent narrator in section 2 of this book?
Yeah, well, it's funny because like when I first read that, and I like listened to this interview that Adania like had, um, and um, the person asking the question around like, or you kind of brought um, that sort of critique up, and he sort of felt like it was unfair to kind of diagnose these like
Mm,
characters, right? Like the soldier, like being a psychopath, like, when it like, he was just saying like that shouldn't be like the entire like military is a psychopath that
mm,
like, not necessarily him or like, and then that, the protagonist in the second story who is unnamed, like all these people are unnamed, right? But like, is it fair to call this person like, high on the autism spectrum
mm,
if like you have lived the entire, your entire life you've lived under, genocide and like how do
mm,
you not have these kind of like intense like feelings and like kind of this you know, cognitive battles, and like every, thing just being really heightened.
mm.
Um,
Woo.
so yeah, so that, like that kind of came, and I was like, oh, okay, like, so I don't know, like when I'm thinking about, you know, I think that's the difference when I think about, our daughter, like, um, but I don't know, like, I think that, to me, like even if I, considered that, this person, this character woman is high on the spectrum, it's like when I did read that, it was like, wow, like, it's just this constant agonizing pain, right? Like
Mhm,
of, you know, every little thing is just heightened. And so,
mhm,
is that, sometimes I think about like, is that how it is? Like when I like processes like, all this information, like some of it is like really painful and intense and like, how do you sort of navigate that as a parent? How do you, help a person, be more comfortable in the environment.
mm.
So it's like, the inability to have control or like to, um, it's this that battle of control, I guess.
Yeah.
Really.
Mm. Well, and you're making me think of something that super jumped out at me and caught my attention that um, I think because you know me so well will not surprise you at all. But this will actually lead into the next piece that I want to ask you about. And so this is from the second section, it's one paragraph where we have our protagonist, this Palestinian woman, and she says, "The borders imposed between things here are many. One must pay attention to them and navigate them, which ultimately protects everyone from perilous consequences. This grants a person a sense of serenity despite everything else. There are some people who navigate borders masterfully, who never trespass, but these people are few, and I'm not one of them. As soon as I see a border, I either race toward it and leap over it or cross it stealthily with a step. Neither of these two behaviors is conscious or rooted in a premeditated desire to resist borders. It's more like sheer stupidity. To be quite honest, once I cross a border, I fall into a deep pit of anxiety. It's a matter, simply put, of clumsiness. Once I realized that I inevitably fail wherever I try to navigate borders, I decided to stay within the confines of my house as much as possible. And since this house has many windows, through which the neighbors and their children can easily see me and catch me trespassing borders even when I'm in my own house, I hung the curtains, although I'll inevitably forget to close them sometimes. All right. And so I would, I will not in any way, shape, or form kind of liken myself to having the experience of a Palestinian heritage woman under
Right.
occupation, but so much of kind of this idea of like borders in like my, feeling like growing up feeling clumsy that like I was crossing these borders that I, as a mixed heritage, multiracial person, um, with like mixed class identity, mixed religious identity, like would like overstep and like I could see it like causing people discomfort or in like, in hindsight seeing that I'd like made a quote unquote mistake, whether that was real or perceived, like super jumped out at me. But kind of moving to this next piece around the politics of space and place, Shigli's descriptions of whether it's like the desert and its oppressive vastness are laden with all these like political and like emotional weights. And so I'm wondering, how do you interpret the role of space in shaping characters' experiences? How might this connect to your own explorations of space, place, quote unquote, borders, and identity in your art teaching, particularly as someone with an immigrant experience and as a woman of color?
Yeah, that the the page that you read was like I remember reading that and like sending that to Ben. I was like, "Oh my God, this
Mhm.
this page right here." And yeah, I think, the crossing of borders is like, is like, there's like geographical borders, right? There's like, these, you know, um places that, we're not allowed or like we're not or and there's places that like, you're protected, right? But like what
Mhm.
happens like if there is no place where you're protected, like
Yeah,
so this kind of like the effects on the body, like when you don't have there's nowhere to go, right?
yeah.
And like what that does to sort of the psyche or like, your the internally what that does. So it's like the crossing of borders, like your like the mental borders, right? Like the psychological sort of borders, is sort of like what almost Shibli like taps into as she's like sort of writing, right?
Mm.
Is just this kind of going in and out of the cognitive like conflicts that the Palestinian like woman goes through when she's like, should I go there? Or like, should I go? Or
Yeah,
like, should there's like a lot of just
yeah,
like this debate like in her head um and like kind of like what that I imagine like I can't
yeah,
even like
absolutely.
fathom, right? Like,
Yeah.
um
Like a
what
constant risk reward calculation that happens
yeah,
with her.
yeah. So I think, I feel like crossing like borders is really, I don't know, to me when I think about it, it's like you're looking for like liberation, right? Like it's like you're
Mhm.
trying to be free of something. So like I need to like cross this,
Yeah,
right? It's like this crossing of something because I'm like being controlled by
sure.
something here. So let me move through here. Like to, so I think like whether that be like geographical, like or like, this mental like sort of state. I think like it's a person in search for something like to be released of something or to
Mm.
locate or to locate something that will assist them in some way, right? So I
Yeah.
think, you know, um, as I don't know, like as, as a first generation, like that's, when I think about like, my parents,
Mhm.
crossing like, migrating over, it's just like this, to the purpose of like more opportunity. Like it's really, about, thinking about how do we get closer to like like what we consider as liberation, right? Like this
Mm,
freedom. Um, so I think, that like that's kind of, I guess when I think about it is like about borders and like space and like place is you're really like in search or wanting to connect to, these different forms of like liberation for
yeah.
yourself.
Ooh. And it's making me think of, the irony in, it's like she has to borrow a colleague's
Art, yeah,
ID card to like try, right? So it's like in her search to like uncover what happened to, this Bedouin woman in 1949, she also has to cover who she is and like pretend in order
yeah,
to find the truth.
yeah,
And like how much that ties to what you were just sharing about, a lot of kind of immigrant experience,
right.
historically, particularly in a country, a society that is historically, been incredibly xenophobic. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I wanted to add too, like, we were talking about like why she's like, the characters are in here is like are unnamed, right? But then
mhm.
like the places, like when you're reading, like the places are named, right? Because it's
Yeah.
that whole kind of like um this the name, like the adding like a name is like that the sort of results of like settler colonialism, right? Like this, like,
Uh-huh.
I place this name like here, like I
Mhm.
think, I did read something around like, Adania doesn't like to place like names on like her
Mm,
characters because it's like this whole thing of like the whole fragmented piece is like where they're like, parts. They're like it's just a piece of a whole. Like it's like a,
yeah.
these characters are like, many other characters in like places that, have gone through genocide and um so yeah, when I think about, even like, space and place, like like these places that are like named and like or like claimed and like, conquered. Um, but
I mean, yeah, so well said. And, it's like, yeah, I mean, even makes me think of, right, like uh, West Contra Costa County, Richmond, El Cerrito, San Pablo, El Sobrani, like
yeah,
these are not the names of the indigenous lands of, the land that we're on.
yeah.
And who gets to name what, and
Hmm.
how is kind of self-determination around people naming themselves, empowering, decolonizing.
Yeah.
Um, I want to shift gears slightly. I mean, a lot of this, all these things kind of interweave in so many ways, which is, so much of the brilliance of this novel. But moving to kind of these themes around gender and violence, and the novel, intricately weaving gendered and sexual violence into its narrative in all these, like subtle and complex ways. Um, and so, a question I have for you is, how do you think Sibley handles this sensitive subject? How might art and education contribute to deeper conversations about gender, power dynamics, especially as it relates to legacies of colonialism, militarism, and violence against women?
Yeah, I feel like we kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, just, um, in the way and like the dualism and like, um, and the way the perspectives are written, right? So, because, that first story is, it's written as third person, like, um, and I think, like how it was written was like more kind of like what was it like kind of anecdotal, right? Like
Mm,
there's like it was like emotionless and like more kind of like fact-based. And the the second part, it's like all sort of emotion, right? Like it's just, that the perspective of the Palestinian women and like just kind of her battles, right?
Hmm.
And I don't know, there's just kind of this what happens to the body sort of like with overt versus like covert like power, right? So it's like,
Mm, yeah.
like there's this thing of like where for the Palestinian women, it's like, in the second part, just kind of just sort of the kind of almost like neurotic
Mm,
uh you know feelings that she was having with wanting to kind of uncover the story um that she was very drawn by this minor sort of detail.
yeah.
And we didn't really talk about the minor detail. And the minor detail is like that, she's drawn to the fact that what happened during the gang rape happened actually 25 years before the time she was born, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
And so she's really like, struck by sort of this, and goes kind of out of her way to kind of uncover like parts of this like story.
Yeah.
But that there's something interesting in the fascination that it wasn't really around the gang rape, right? It
Mm,
was just the detail of like it being kind of really like connected to her like her birth.
totally.
Um and I don't know, the part of me is just like, is that because like, like she's a woman, or like I don't know, there's like this disconnect to the violence piece and like the maybe the covert like thing of like of sort of the effects of like settler colonialism, where it's not like this like aggressive and direct like um sort of attacked on her body, that
Mm.
she's that I don't know what I'm trying to say.
No, no, no.
But like,
I think I'm totally with you. Like, I'm wondering. Well, this was where I started wondering, even actually before I read that piece on the back of the book. I was like wondering, to what degree could this be a part of her being neurodivergent? Like that's the minor detail that like captures her attention, right? But and
right.
or like maybe she's not, right? And there's so much that we don't know about neurodivergency and so much new kind of research happening every single day. But also to your points, like the other question is like to what degree has you know settler colonialism via the Palestinian experience and via specifically violence against women been, so normalized that there's
Right.
like a numbness or a disconnect that she
Yeah.
approaches it with. That's kind of what I got, like, was getting from what you were saying.
Yeah, there's like something around like that versus like if I, my wondering is like what, and to what I was speaking to earlier around like the perspectives, like the written perspective, like what it the story would have been like if it was written in the perspective of the woman who was
Hmm.
or the
Who
girl
was
that
who
was
was
right,
killed?
right.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, who's, in this aggressive sort of like um like this overpowering of like these, the soldiers. So there's, I don't know, there's like something around that I feel like um is just like worth kind of looking at like through time, the effects of the mind and the body,
Mm,
depending on like how power is, you know, imposed or like put on
mm,
you, or like, and then, there's things around like male domination and like
yep,
toxic masculinity, right?
yep.
Like, and this, with the soldier, it's like the way Adania kind of like writes through that perspective, like
Yeah,
what I was saying, like this kind of anecdotal, like is very factual, like it's sort of
totally
devoid
cold.
of like emotions, right?
Yep.
Um, and it made me think about like Ocean Vuong's, like, his what he said in that one interview. I can't remember what talk show host, but it
Words of
was like,
destruction.
yeah, like it's just like what happens to, like boys and like men when, the only way to evaluate, themselves is through, yeah, the lexicon of like death and like destruction. So it's like, if you're brought up into a world where like, you're capable of like destroying things, right? Like
Mm,
like the language and like the culture around you is like, is focused on like violence. Like what does that like how are you detached from
yep.
sort of the, the emotion and like the acts of violence that you're inflicting on like on people,
Yeah.
um or
Yeah.
women,
Yeah.
in this case.
You're reminding me of that we didn't talk about at all is what Adania does that I thought was so dope and so like yeah, just like I was like that's really really clean was the soldier, the commander, the Israeli soldier, 1949 during the Nakba, like something gets into his tent and like bites him. And it was like, is it a
Yeah,
snake or a
right.
spider? Right. And there's just like this wound begins to
Yeah,
fester and like slowly starts like, like messing him up. And you see him slowly getting sicker and sicker. And I totally read that, as like, this like metaphor for like all the things you were describing, right? Of just like
yeah,
severing your mind from your heart,
yeah,
and how it like, he's like the poisonous venom or whatever is in him is like slowly taking over his body.
right.
And like that kind of being, I was like wondering if that was like Shibley's like attempt at this metaphor for like this is kind of like what ends up happening to the oppressor, the dominator, in these
Yeah,
kind of violent relationships is like they're simultaneously being poisoned themselves as they inflict these horrific things
right.
onto people.
Yeah, I think, what's amazing, even more amazing, right? Because like, what we were saying about like, or I might have mentioned like, this, her use of like repetition, right? Like
Mm,
that what you hear and like these kind of minor details that kind of hear in the first part, like you also, it gets revealed in the second part of the story with the,
hmm.
with the women, like because the spider appears in the car when she's going off to
Yep.
go,
Oh, and the
and like this,
gasoline smell on the clothes.
yeah, so there's like, the like parts of that sort of, those minor details, like, appear
Totally.
as like these kind of subconsciously, right? Like this tapping of the subconscious and like the haunting of,
Hmm.
these objects in space and like what that does to the psyche. Because like what you were
Yep.
saying could be like, when you apply it to, in her case, the Palestinian women, like what is that sort of a metaphor for?
Totally.
As she's trying to go through these like, crossing these borders, right? Like what is this kind of like this fear that that's constantly instilled like in the mind or in the psyche that this spider might be related to or like is
Yep.
connected to, and like the dog barking, like you hear that like there's like a dog barking like in the beginning, and like
Hmm.
as the woman who is like going through rape, like you hear this dog barking and like you hear the
Yeah.
dog barking and so
Absolutely.
it's just wild to like, to see that and like what yeah, it just kind of feeds into the whole like fragmentation and like
Completely.
yeah, I
And it's
never really
making
went
me,
to that.
oh my goodness, it's making me think of how much you and I like to watch scary movies and like horror because you said haunting, right? And I think about like in so many uh in so many cultures, and I'm thinking specific, I mean in all cultures, but I'm thinking specifically of like cultures of people of color, that like the role that kind of ghosts play in like trying to talk about or unearth or uncover like really difficult things that like are difficult for us to talk about generationally. You were talking about Gabor Mate and thinking like he has like In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts is one of his books, and because at the end, right, I'm like wondering if there's like these appearance of potential ghosts, right? Of
Yeah,
like the girl who sticks her head out when she's like there. And she's like,
right.
is that the ghost of this girl? And then the old woman who she like notes, the narrator notes, like would be about the age of, if she had
Oh,
survived
right.
today, who then walks off and then she like follows her. Right.
Yeah.
And we won't tell the very ending of the story. But
Yeah.
I mean, I'm thinking about, in what ways do ghost stories, quote unquote, get used to kind of uncover things that are like really, really difficult to talk about. And so
Hmm.
in that vein, I want to move to kind of we're getting closer to the end, but uh, one of these, kind of last themes is the unspoken and the unseen. And so actually, so the Guardian, on the back of this book, the Guardian says that Minor Detail is a highly sophisticated narrative that pitilessly explores the limits of empathy and the desire to right, or WRITE, historical wrongs by giving a voice to the voiceless. And what I wrote here is when asked about being her being a voice for the voiceless, the Indian writer Arundhati Roy, who's one of my favorite writers, says there is no such thing as the voiceless, but rather the intentionally silenced or the preferably unheard. And so a recurring theme in Minor Detail is the absence of explicit detail, leaving much being unsaid. And so, I'm wondering, how do you think this mirrors real world histories or present realities of erasure, marginalization? You've already spoken to some of this.
Yeah.
How might educators and or artists address these silences in their work?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I kind of sort of mentioned just like what gets left out of like the dominant narrative.
Yeah.
And I mean, like still like, in media, right? Like the censoring and like silencing of stories and, the media and um like it's again, the reason why, I sort of gravitated towards, this book, and it's like kind of been a goal of mine the past few months is just being able to kind of to read and like more from Palestinian writers and
Hmm.
perspectives, and that's something that we as educators, artists, like whether it be looking at and supporting artists, Palestinian artists, those who are who've gone through genocide,
Hmm.
making sure that we're reading and teaching and like what you're doing, like in
Hmm.
your job right now as a professor of
I'm
ethnic
trying.
studies. um, and it's important. I mean, I'm being part of this interview is one thing, one little
Hmm.
piece of thing that I can do to kind
Hmm.
of share this kind of perspective. And
Yeah.
yeah, like I think it also just, you know, Adania is just brilliant. Like, and just imagining, other Palestinian writers that with this sort of perspective, or like this sort of, it's just, this book is just so unique. I've not read anything like, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't
I
do a lot
agree.
of reading, I guess. So, But there's just, so I could just imagine, like, that there are many, many people that have been overshadowed by,
Yep.
you know, mainstream culture. Um, so yeah,
Mm.
no.
Well, and in that, I want to go to, the last kind of theme that we'll talk about before we close up. And that's the role of empathy in art and storytelling. And so, despite the novel's kind of pretty stark tone, it invites readers to feel deep empathy, I would argue. And so I'm wondering, like, how do you think, Shibli fosters empathy without maybe being too overt? And what lessons can we take from her from this approach when teaching or creating art?
Yeah, I think, um, there's just something around like suffering,
Mm,
what we were talking about, and the writing of from a different frame, right? A different perspective. I think
yep.
there's a way that she is um able to capture like suffering, right? Whether it be even from the bug bite or the spider bite of the
Mm,
of the of the soldier, of the commander, right? And like suffering in different ways, like also the suffering of like land, and like the
mm,
um as you see that through time, like as you read through time, like what happens to the land, like from um you know uh within the span of 25 years, she kind of writes about and the women who drives across these borders. It's like she sees the differences that occurs um with land being destroyed,
yep. 100%.
um so it's not just like empathy through like the having empathy for the people. It's also like the land, right?
Mm,
And the suffering of the land. I don't know. I think, um, I think that the lesson, I think, for me is just that we just, need to, find parts of ourselves where like we're decolonizing, like we're questioning, from what parts of myself do I feel like I'm being controlled,
mm,
or where can I relinquish that control,
mhm,
and or what has been passed on to me,
mhm,
that what are the colonized parts of me.
mhm,
So really questioning like those parts, and whether it be like through your art making or through writing, like how do you kind of question those parts that are might not authentically be you,
mm,
and like how do you liberate yourself, like how do you move towards sort of like this liberation, and wanting liberation for like other people. um I don't know, I feel like I have been getting that through Adania and the way she writes and
mm,
uses literature and language.
yep.
Is this whole thing of like relinquishing control, right? Like
Hmm.
even through the way, like in
Wow.
the structure of her writing, it's like how do I like it's like not giving a name to these characters. Like how do you
Yep.
relinquish control? Like not
Ooh.
writing in this linear narrative, like you know it's all that. And I feel like you know for it's an encouragement. I think it's she's kind of
Mm,
encouraged me to like kind of look at what parts of myself do I feel like I'm creating, and staying within the borders, like where
mm,
can I cross my borders and like
hmm,
find other parts of myself. Yeah, so I think like that's kind of um the power in this sort of story.
hmm. Man, so beautifully said. And I think that you said it so well, I don't have anything to follow. But as we close, I have two kind of questions for you to close out. And the first is since a little curveball for you here. Since we're both music lovers, what is a song, a musical artist, and or an album that you would pair with this book?
Ooh,
And then the second question is why should people read this short but powerful novella by Adania Shibli?
okay. So, man, an album or a song?
Song or album or a musical artist or all of it that you would pair with this.
Hmm,
Maybe has the same vibes or energy or comes to your mind.
right. Why did I don't know like why this came to my mind. I don't want it to be, but like I think, I keep thinking of DJ Shadow. So like
Huh. That's so funny because I had that thought too. That's so
what?
funny. Yeah, really. Like, okay, tell me why. That is so funny.
I don't know. I just like there's just thing around like I don't know. I've always been fascinated by like dualism, and I feel like there's thing around like light and shadow, and like there's this like you know, and I like shadow just kind of came to my head, I guess, and then I was like, oh, DJ Shadow, and like I remember you sort of playing the album when we were watching what was the animation?
Oh,
Uh,
Akira.
yeah, Akira, Akira, and like this. I don't know that I just kind of just pictured that for some reason. So I don't know.
Hmm.
Why did you think of DJ Shadow?
I'm not sure, but Midnight in a Perfect World came to my mind, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like
that's
this,
the
yeah, this,
mundane, like
yeah, it's this
monotonous
combination.
or
Yeah, it's what's this combination of like, it's like midnight and it's like super dark, right? And like you
yeah.
can't really see, right? But then it's like in a perfect world, right? So it's like this yin yang, of the light and the dark, right? Like
Yeah.
kind of coming together. And it
Yeah.
felt like, yeah, that's so funny that you said DJ. So
Yeah.
I'm like, did I did I telepathically send that to you? Um,
Yeah, no, there's just something about like that's also like haunting like
com
about it.
completely,
So
completely.
I feel like this book is like very it's like in the realm of horror, right? Like that's what
Mm.
they like it like especially the end it's just like,
The
oh my God.
supernatural. Yeah, dude. It was
Yeah.
chilling. The end is like chilling. Um, but yeah, and then so then the last question is, yeah, why should people read this short but powerful novella by Adania Shibli?
I mean, if you're looking for something like something new, something unconventional, something just like to get you on the edge of your like toes, and like it's a
Mhm.
quick read. You can probably read it in like what
Yeah.
is it? If you're straightforward, like maybe 2 hours, less than that. I don't know.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, if like just read it.
Mm. I love
It's just
that. I
good.
love
It's
that.
good. I mean, yeah, like all these themes that were mentioned in the beginning is just all just so apparent.
Mm.
Yeah.
I cannot thank you enough for being my first guest here on the Paper Plane podcast, and yeah, I'm just so grateful for you. I love you more than anything in this world,
Love
and
you.
yeah, and so this has been really dope. And yeah, just thank you so much.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And so for all those tuning in, thank you so much for checking in with us. Huge shout out to Adania Shibli and to artist educator Emalyn de Rama Lopez, and to our babies Aya, Halia, and Mayari Sky, and to our family, friends, and community. Peace. Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye bye. Thank you.